The room was warm with the glow of crystal chandeliers, the kind of light that makes everything look softer, kinder, even when it isn't. I sat at the end of the long table, listening to the hum of conversations and the clinking of wine glasses, when his voice rose above it all. He leaned back in his chair, smirking, and pointed straight at me. "She's just an old lady. No job, no power, no clue." Laughter spilled out from the men around him, rich and unrestrained, as if they'd been waiting for that moment all evening. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I simply lifted my glass, took a slow sip, and let the wine rest on my tongue. Inside, I thought, if only they knew whose name was printed at the bottom of their paychecks. I placed the glass down gently, the stem cool against my fingers, and allowed a small smile to touch my lips. By the next time I saw them, that laughter would be gone. "Thank you for being here and giving me your time. It means more than you might think. I know what it feels like to have someone look straight at you and decide, in that single glance, that you are less than what you are." Tell me, have you ever been underestimated right to your face, made small in front of others as if your worth could be measured by the sound of their laughter? If you have, write below. I kept quiet, because sometimes silence says more than 1,000 words. And while you are here with me, let me know where you are listening from. Because even though we may be far apart, in this moment, we are sitting together in the same story. Before that night, my life was quiet. The kind of quiet people mistake for emptiness. I was widowed, past 60, dressed in plain clothes that were neat, but never meant to impress, and I spoke softly enough that some assumed I had nothing worth saying. They saw the surface and decided that was all there was. What they didn't see was the life I had built behind it. 15 years ago, when my husband was still alive, we took what we had saved over decades and placed it into a small, struggling startup no one believed would survive the year. We believed in it, even when it meant long nights over ledgers and coffee, even when we had to ignore the people who told us we were throwing our future away. The company grew slowly at first, then faster, until it became something far bigger than either of us had imagined. When the board offered me a seat, I accepted on one condition: that I would stay silent, my role hidden, my voice reserved for the moments that truly mattered. My nephew, the same man who would later laugh at me that night, came into the company years later because I opened a door for him. He never knew how he got there. He never asked. And he certainly never knew who held the key. The charity dinner was the kind of event where the room felt polished from the floor to the ceiling, with crystal glasses catching the soft glow of the chandeliers and a quiet hum of conversation moving like a gentle current through the air. A string quartet played in the corner, their music weaving in and out of the clinking of silverware, and the scent of roasted lamb and fresh bread lingered between the tables. I sat at the far end, my seat, chosen more for its distance than its view, a glass of wine in my hand, the deep red catching the light each time I tilted it. From where I sat, I could hear my nephew's voice carrying over the music, full of confidence and just enough arrogance to make his friends lean in. He spoke about his recent promotion, about how he had earned it through his own brilliance, his words dripping with pride. Then, almost with a laugh, he mocked the idea of nepotism hires, tossing the phrase around like a private joke, not realizing he was describing himself. His friends chuckled in agreement, some glancing toward me briefly, their eyes sliding over me with the easy dismissal reserved for someone they believe is only there because she has nothing better to do. I kept my gaze steady on the rim of my glass, my lips curved just enough to hide the thoughts forming behind them. There was no need to speak. Not yet. It happened so quickly, yet the moment stretched in my mind like it was determined to leave a mark. My nephew, leaning back in his chair with the kind of smug ease that only comes from thinking you're untouchable, turned his attention toward me. His voice carried across the table, clear enough that every ear nearby caught it. "She's sweet, but she couldn't run a lemonade stand." The words seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat before the table erupted. Laughter rolled around me, loud and unrestrained, bouncing off the walls and settling into every corner of the room. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame, but from the kind of slow, simmering anger that comes when you are underestimated in plain sight. My fingers tightened around the stem of my wine glass, pressing just enough that I wondered if the delicate glass would snap between my hands. But I didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I let my shoulders relax, allowed my lips to curl into a calm, measured smile, and held it just long enough for him to notice. Inside, my thoughts were steady and sharp. You just wrote your own ending. That night, long after the dinner ended and the sound of their laughter had faded into the cold air outside, I walked home with a steady rhythm in my steps, the echo of my heels on the pavement almost keeping time with my thoughts. I didn't feel the need to replay their words. They were already etched into my mind with enough clarity to last a lifetime. What I thought about instead was the years I had spent building quietly, the careful patience it had taken to let people underestimate me, and how a moment like tonight was the reason I had chosen to stay in the shadows for so long. I hung my coat, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat at the small desk in my living room where the lamplight fell across old photographs and neatly stacked papers. I reached for the phone, dialing a number I hadn't called in years but knew by heart. When the line clicked and his familiar voice answered, I didn't waste time with small talk. My voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was no mistaking the weight in it. "It's time," I said. There was a pause, then the faint sound of him leaning forward in his chair. "Prepare the red folder." There was no confusion in his tone when he asked, "How many?" I let the silence sit for a moment before answering, each word deliberate. "All of them." He exhaled slowly, and I could hear the faint creak of his chair as he stood. This was not a man who needed explanations. He had been there in the early days, back when the company was nothing but a handful of desks and a borrowed coffee machine, back when my husband and I had put everything on the line to keep it afloat. He had watched me sit quietly in board meetings, had noticed how I listened more than I spoke, and had understood that silence can be a weapon if you know when to use it. "Consider it done," he said, his voice low but certain. When I hung up, I felt no rush of victory, no satisfaction. Only a deep, steady certainty that by the time the sun set again, the balance would shift, and those who laughed at me tonight would wake to a different kind of reality. The kind they never saw coming. 15 years ago feels like a lifetime, and yet I can still remember the weight of those days as if they were folded neatly into the pocket of my memory. My husband's health had begun to fail, not all at once, but in the way that creeps up quietly, stealing little pieces of strength without warning. We spent countless evenings in the worn armchairs of our small living room, the soft ticking of the clock the only sound between us as we read through business reports and market forecasts. The papers were often spread across the coffee table, some pages marked with notes in his careful handwriting, others with figures I had circled in red. It wasn't the life most people would have chosen at our age, but we weren't most people. We had one chance to make something bigger than ourselves. And when the opportunity came to invest in a small, struggling startup, we didn't flinch. It was risky. Painfully risky. Friends told us we were foolish, that we should be thinking about comfort and safety instead of pouring our savings into something that might not survive the year. But there was something in the way that little company fought to stay alive. Something in the determination of the handful of employees who worked there that reminded me of us. They believed in what they were building, and so did we. We didn't just give them money, we gave them faith. And in those early years, that mattered more than they knew. The climb was slow at first. Every quarter we would receive updates, small victories, hard losses, moments when it seemed they might not make it. I learned to read more than numbers. I learned to read between the lines, to hear the tone in the CEO's letters, to sense when the smiles in their photographs were hiding worry. I became an observer, patient and deliberate, taking in every detail. And then, slowly, things began to change. A good year turned into a better one, with a small profit turned into a steady climb, and eventually the company began to attract attention from people who had once dismissed it entirely. When the board offered me a seat, it was not out of charity, but out of recognition for what we had risked and what we had helped build. Yet I made a choice that puzzled even those who respected me most. I asked for my position to remain quiet. No announcements, no publicity, not even my name on the glossy pages of company reports. I wanted to watch from the shadows, to see how people acted when they thought I had no influence at all. I learned quickly that power does not always need to be seen to be felt, and that there is a freedom in being underestimated. In those years, I sat at the back of boardrooms, letting others speak first, listening to the way they positioned themselves, noting who reached for credit and who quietly carried the real weight. I signed documents with a steady hand, voted on decisions that shaped the company's path, and all the while, I remained the person no one thought twice about when they passed me in the hallway. It was a role I wore like armor, a shield against arrogance and vanity, because the less they saw, the more I learned. And now, all these years later, the very invisibility they gave me was about to become the sharpest tool I had. Quiet power is the kind they never see coming, until it is already too late. When the dinner finally ended, I rose from my chair without a word, letting the scrape of it against the polished floor be the only sound I left behind. I walked out into the night, the heavy doors closing behind me, and was met by the kind of cold air that bites at your cheeks and clears every cloud from your thoughts. The streetlights cast long, narrow shadows across the pavement, and each step of my heels struck against it with a crisp, steady rhythm, echoing in the quiet. I didn't rush. I wanted the walk, needed the space between that table and my front door to let every detail settle in my mind. The night had not been just about their laughter. It had been about the way they looked at me when the words were spoken. The way not one of them thought twice about joining in. It was about the smirks I had seen before, in other rooms and other years, from people who thought age made you irrelevant, who thought quiet meant weak, who thought that if you weren't shouting your worth, you must not have any. I had seen those faces when I was younger, when I was a woman starting out in a world that didn't expect me to get far. I had seen them when I had less, when every opportunity had to be fought for twice as hard and held on to twice as tight. With every block I walked, I thought about each time someone had told me I wasn't enough. The teacher who said I didn't have the right mind for business, the banker who told my husband we were wasting our savings on a doomed investment, the colleague who once spoke over me in a meeting as if my words didn't matter. And now my own nephew. Sitting at that table, speaking as though I had been nothing more than a shadow on the wall. Their voices all blended together in my mind until they became the same laugh, the same smirk, the same dismissal. But under the sting, something else had been building, steady and strong, a resolve that had been tempered over years of patience, of watching, of learning. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly what I could do. There would be no second chance for them to put me in that seat and make me the punchline again. This was the last time. By the time I reached my front steps, I felt the cold, not as a chill, but as a clarity. I opened my door, stepped inside, and set my purse on the table. My hand moved automatically to the drawer, where I kept the small things I didn't need often, but never misplaced. From it, I took the boardroom key, the same one I had carried for years, its brass worn smooth at the edges. I held it for a long moment in the lamplight, feeling the weight of it in my palm before slipping it into my purse. I knew exactly where I would be on Monday morning, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself the smallest smile. On Monday morning, I was awake long before the first hint of daylight touched the sky. The house was still, the air cool and quiet, and as I dressed, there was no rush in my movements, only purpose. I chose a dark wool coat, one that hung neatly over my shoulders, and shoes that carried a firm, confident step. On the small table by the door sat the red folder, its surface smooth and crisp, the corners sharp, and inside the weight of every decision I had made over the weekend. It wasn't just paper, it was finality bound between two covers, the kind of thing that could close doors forever and open others in an instant. I picked it up, holding it under my arm as though it were simply another file, but I could feel the power in its heft. The streets were nearly empty as I drove through the early morning darkness, the world outside caught between night and day. By the time I reached the company headquarters, the first pale light was brushing against the tops of the buildings, but the lobby inside was still bathed in the steady glow of its tall glass fixtures. The marble floor stretched out before me, polished to a shine that reflected every movement, and as I stepped forward, the sound of my heels echoed across the vast space, steady and deliberate, each step marking the beginning of something they could not undo. I passed through the lobby without hesitation, the folder held close against me, and approached the reception desk. She looked up from her computer, the young receptionist who had worked here for only a short while. I had seen her before, but never like this, never with her attention caught so completely. Her eyes flicked from my face to the folder in my hands, and I could see the flicker of curiosity there, as if she could feel the tension that trailed behind me. I placed the red folder on the desk in front of her, the sound of it landing softer than it should have for something carrying so much weight. "Deliver these at noon," I said, my voice calm, even, leaving no space for questions. She blinked, her hands hovering above the folder, and for a moment she didn't move, as if she was deciding whether to ask what was inside. I met her gaze and held it, not unkindly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who expects to be obeyed. Slowly, she reached out and pulled the folder toward her, her fingers brushing the edge like she was touching something fragile, though we both knew it was anything but. I turned then, without another word, and walked toward the elevators. Behind me, I could feel her eyes still fixed on me, and I knew she had never seen this side of me before. Few had, and by the end of the day, far more would. By the time noon arrived, the air inside the building had shifted. It was no longer the usual hum of ringing phones and muted conversations. There was something sharper, heavier, running underneath it all. Whispers moved from desk to desk, little fragments of questions and half-formed guesses that faded the moment someone stepped too close. I could see the movement from my position in the boardroom, the way people leaned toward each other, their eyes darting toward the hallway that led to HR. The red folder had done its work before a single word had been spoken aloud. The first to be called in was one of my nephew's closest friends, a man whose voice I had heard more in jokes and gossip than in anything useful for the company. He walked toward the HR office with a careless swagger, but it didn't last long. Minutes later, he emerged holding a plain white envelope, his face pale, his lips pressed tightly together. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. Another name was called, then another, each one connected to that table at the charity dinner, each one disappearing into that room with uncertainty and walking out with the same envelope in hand. When my nephew's name finally came over the intercom, there was a beat of stillness in the open space around him. He sat for a moment, pretending not to hear, then slowly rose from his chair as though he was walking into something he still believed he could talk his way out of. I watched from the doorway as he stepped into the HR office, his expression a mix of irritation and forced confidence. On the desk in front of him lay his letter, a single sheet of paper with words that left no room for misunderstanding. My signature, in bold black ink, sat at the bottom, steady and unmistakable. He looked up at me, disbelief tightening his voice. "You can't do this." I met his gaze, my tone as calm and unshaken as if we were discussing the weather. "I just did." For a moment, he opened his mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, he stood there staring at the paper in his hands, as though it might change if he looked at it long enough. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice or remind him of the dinner, the laughter, or the way he had spoken to me. This wasn't about revenge dressed in anger. It was about balance. About ending what they had started the moment they decided I was nothing. I turned to leave, my steps unhurried, my composure unshaken. Behind me, the sound of the HR manager's voice quietly moving on to the next name filled the room. By the end of that hour, every man at that table would be holding the same letter, their futures changed by the same signature they had never thought to respect, and I would walk away knowing I had given them exactly what they had earned. It didn't take long for the sound of heavy footsteps to break the quiet of the boardroom. The door swung open with a sharp push, and there he was, my nephew, his face flushed, his tie loosened, his eyes filled with the kind of outrage that comes from losing control. He didn't wait to be acknowledged. His voice rose immediately, cutting through the stillness like he believed volume alone could restore his position. "What is this? What have you done?" I didn't raise my voice in return. I simply lifted my hand and gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Sit." It wasn't a suggestion, and after a moment of standing there, caught between anger and the faint realization that this wasn't a fight he could win on noise alone, he obeyed. He dropped into the chair, leaning forward, trying to make his presence loom over the table, but his eyes kept flicking toward the papers stacked neatly at my side. I looked at him with the same calm I had carried since that night at the charity dinner, my words measured and deliberate. "You called me powerless," I said, letting the weight of the memory settle between us. "But I built this company, and while you've been busy using it as a stage for your arrogance, I've been watching you poison it for years." He started to protest, tripping over his own excuses. He blamed others, claimed misunderstandings, tried to twist every point into something smaller, something less damaging. I listened without interrupting, my gaze steady, until his voice faltered under the realization that none of his words were shifting the ground beneath him. Then, without breaking eye contact, I reached for the file beside me and slid it across the table toward him. The folder landed with a soft thud, but its contents carried a weight no sound could measure. Records of his decisions that had cost the company money, proof of contracts he had pushed through for personal gain, emails that revealed far more than he ever wanted read aloud. He glanced down at the first page, then quickly looked away, his jaw tightening, his hands curling slightly at the edges of the file, as though he might crumple it out of existence. "You taught everyone I was nothing," I told him, my voice steady, almost quiet, but unshakable. "Today, I taught them who I am." He looked at me then, really looked, and I could see the shift in his eyes. The moment he understood that the person he had laughed at, dismissed, and underestimated was the same person who had just taken apart the foundation he thought was unshakable. I didn't need to say more. The silence between us did the rest, filling the room with the truth he could no longer deny. When it was done, I gathered the remaining papers on the table, placing them neatly back into my folder, my movements unhurried, each one a small act of finality. I stood, and without glancing back, walked toward the door, my footsteps steady against the polished floor. The hallway outside felt different now, lighter somehow, as though the building itself had shifted under the weight of what had just taken place. I moved past desks where people quickly lowered their eyes, not out of shame for me, but out of the quiet awareness that they had witnessed something they would not forget. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and as they closed behind me, I allowed myself a slow, deep breath. The descent to the lobby was silent, but it carried the satisfaction of a battle fought without shouting, without spectacle, and won entirely on the strength of preparation and patience. When the doors slid open again, the marble lobby stretched before me, the morning sun now pouring through the tall glass windows in bright golden streaks. I stepped outside, and the sunlight met my face with a warmth that sank all the way into my chest. The city was alive with its usual noise, car engines, footsteps, voices calling to each other across the street, and to me it all sounded like applause. As I walked toward the curb, I thought about the difference between the kind of power they had flaunted and the kind I had carried all these years. Loud power demands attention. It feeds on being seen, on the noise it can make in a room. Quiet power waits, observes, learns the patterns, and strikes only when the moment is right. Loud power can burn bright, but it burns out quickly. Quiet power endures, and that day had proven, even to those who had never believed it before, which one outlasts the other. I glanced back once at the tall building, not out of regret or doubt, but as a final acknowledgement of the years I had spent letting them underestimate me within its walls. Then I looked forward again, my eyes settling on the car parked just ahead. Leaning against it was the man who had answered my call without hesitation, the ally who had been there in the earliest days of the company, back when our desks were second-hand and our coffee machine barely worked. He was watching me now with a quiet smile, his arms folded loosely, as though he already knew the answer to the question he didn't need to ask. As I reached him, he straightened slightly, his eyes meeting mine with the same steady confidence he'd had all those years ago. "You owned the room," he said simply. There was no exaggeration in his tone, no need for embellishment. He knew as well as I did that the real victory was never about raising my voice or proving them wrong in the heat of an argument. I returned his smile, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something I could carry with ease. "Sometimes," I said, my voice low but certain, "you don't raise your voice to win. You just raise the right paper." And with that, I opened the car door, leaving behind a building full of people who, for the first time, truly knew who I was. As the car door closed beside me and the engine hummed to life, I let my gaze drift forward. The city streets stretching ahead like a map of choices I had drawn myself. There was no need to look back. No urge to see their faces or wonder what words they might be trading behind those walls. What needed to be done was done, and it had been done on my terms. The truth is, victories like this aren't about the noise you make in the moment. They're about the patience you carry through the years, the discipline to hold your ground until the right moment comes, and the courage to act when it finally does. I thought about all the times I had been underestimated, all the rooms where my presence had been ignored, and all the people who had mistaken my silence for weakness. And then I thought about today, about how quickly the ground can shift when the quiet one finally moves. If someone has ever underestimated you, if they've looked at you and decided they already know your limits, I hope you remember this. Your strength is not in proving them wrong the instant they doubt you. It's in knowing you can prove them wrong anytime you choose. And sometimes, you don't have to raise your voice to win. You just have to raise the right paper. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think of your own moment of quiet strength, tell me below. Share your story, or simply write, "I kept quiet." And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about holding your ground and taking back your power, make sure you subscribe. That way you'll never miss the next time someone learns the hard way what it means to underestimate the wrong person. See you on the next video.